Common Ground, a Prairie podcast, is supported by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. If you would like to contribute to our on-the-ground conservation initiatives and our conservation internship and mentorship programs here in North Dakota, please consider making a donation to us through our member support link on our Spotify page. Your contributions will directly support the Walsh County Three Rivers Soil Conservation District, where this year we will plant over 10,000 trees and several hundred acres of conservation grass, pollinators, and cover crops, while also offering hands-on conservation job training to our high school and college interns. You can also support our efforts by liking, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Thank you. Welcome to Common Ground, a Prairie podcast. Western meadowlarks are known to build their nests in the hoofprints of cattle, horses, and bison. They build their homes out of grass, mud, and animal hair, construct roofs to protect their nests from rain, weave the materials for their camouflaged homes into the craters left behind by the herd animals of the prairie. Their flute-like song pierces the stiffest prairie wind. In 1895, it is said that a meadowlark offered a prophecy to Lakota leader Sitting Bull. And today, the iconic grassland birds of the prairie still have much to teach us about how to live in the North American flyway. In today's episode, we ask how a working lands approach to grasslands conservation can bring ranchers and bird enthusiasts together for a common cause. For many outsiders, the Great Plains is better known as Flyover Country. It is a region viewed from 30,000 feet in the window aisle of an airplane. From that vantage, my home region can look like a patchwork quilt. Fields cut into sharp rectangles, the monochromatic colors of sunflower yellow, the lush greens of corn stalks and soybeans, amber waves of grain. But on the ground, the picture comes into focus. We have lost an astounding amount of our prairie grasslands, and with them, we have seen a steady decline in our working ranches and grassland bird populations. Today, we offer you a unique bird's eye view of Flyover Country. We speak with 3 grassland bird researchers who have teamed up with each other to build relationships with ranchers across North Dakota and the broader Great Plains. They help us to understand how working ranches are our best hope for preserving and protecting the prairie and all the species who call it home. We talk with Dr. Andy Boyce of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, who joined us on a Zoom call from his office in Montana. Dr. Boyce is helping to lead innovative research on large-scale projects that treat the grasslands as a broad, interconnected web of relations. Later, we visit with Dr. Susan Felege, a professor at the University of North Dakota, who is collaborating with Dr. Boyce and leading a number of other initiatives in grassland bird research. We met up with Dr. Felege on a rainy morning at a wildlife area designed to protect prairie chickens. Finally, we speak with Ashlyn Herron, a graduate student from Alberta, Canada, who works with Dr. Boyce and Dr. Felege. We met up with Ashlyn at Sertoma Park near the University of North Dakota to discuss her role in the research, which includes what may be the most important work of all, building relationships with local ranchers. In many ways, this episode brings us full circle, back to where we began with our first episode, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Mike Jacobs, who spoke with us at a wetland preserve for migratory shorebirds and waterfowl called Kelly's Slough. By taking this bird's-eye view, we hope listeners will consider how the decline in grasslands has corresponded with the steady decline in grassland bird populations and rural communities. We have lost over 50% of our grassland bird species since 1970, and here in Walsh County, North Dakota, we have lost nearly half of our tax base in the same span of time. Perhaps more importantly, we ask listeners to imagine what an economy rooted in grass could look like. An economy built around locally raised livestock, including the growing demand for bison. An economy built around value and quality, with rich, nutrient-dense food. Currently, I am one of the 45% of rural North Dakotans who live in a food desert. This is an alarming statistic, given how many of us here in the northern Great Plains are surrounded by agricultural land. How can a bird's-eye view of the prairie help us to restore rural communities and grow resilient local economies? These are the questions that drive today's episode. Without further ado, let's start the show. Our first guest is Dr. Susan Felege, a biologist with the University of North Dakota, an avid hunter who spent countless hours in the grasslands. We met up with Dr. Felege on a rainy fall morning and discussed her research, her work with students, and her broader hopes for prairie restoration in the northern Great Plains. What does a day in the life look like for you in this work?
There is not a single one day that is like the next. I have gotten to do all kinds of cool things. Yesterday, I spent the day at Larimore Recreational Area with 30 students learning about wildlife damage and wildlife damage management with USDA Wildlife Services, and teaching students everything from, how do you minimize kind of human-wildlife conflict. And other days I spend tracking gulls and putting tags on them. Some days we're building towers. Sometimes they tease me I'm more of an engineer than a biologist if people see me. Other days I run from meeting to meeting, whether that's doing stuff from, planning projects to, things with field stations at the university, to then back to the classroom where we're talking, birds and wildlife techniques, wildlife management. I mean, every single day of my life is quite different, and that's what I love. I would be not a very good person if every day was exactly the same. They start at all kinds of hours. They go to all kinds of hours of the day. And my background and my day is never in the same place, even, for that matter.
You recently gave the commencement address at UND's summer graduation with a focus on migratory birds. What was that experience like for you, and what can you tell us about how migratory birds inspired your commencement speech? Sure.
It's probably a bit of an emotional thing. Birds are a part of my history all the way back, to my childhood. And so the love of them has been something that's inspired me constantly. I mean, it's something that if you heard my commencement speech or look it up, I was suggested that when you give a commencement speech, it should be something you're passionate about, something you can speak from your heart about, something that really makes you excited so that you can make others excited. And that's what birds have been for me since I was a little kid. I was asked to do this right after I'd had a baby. So I have a 3.5-month-old little boy, and I was really struggling to find what would be inspiring to others. And so I went back to my roots of what inspired me, and that's birds. And they're a thing that makes it really blurry about what's my passion in my professional life versus what's my personal life, because those lines are really, really hard to find in the sand, in that every day I get up and I try to do something that's for conservation, and birds are the way that I do that. Birds are the way that I can speak about the importance of grassland conservation or whatever it is. So what inspired me really was that I've always wanted to do something that's going to help the future when it comes to the natural resources. Birds are it. Birds excite me. Birds are something everyone can relate to. And doing the commencement speech was quite an experience. It was not something that was originally on my bucket list, but maybe now I can check it off. It was a very humbling thing to be asked. It came from the president's office of the university. So, it was one that had a lot of emotions packed in it.
Can you tell us about the work you are doing to track migratory birds with the Kelly's Slough National Wildlife Refuge in relation to the human air traffic near the area?
Yeah, so I first met Andy Boyce when I was trying to develop a MODIS tower network here for bird strike work. And we can talk about that a little bit more, but essentially it's a fancy radio telemetry network that's got a big span from Canada to Mexico, and the ability to work together on radio marked birds. And Andy had already established a couple of towers and been tagging birds. So I went to visit him in Montana, and we hit it off really well. He showed me how his towers were working, some of his bird work. I got a little bit of training on tagging some songbirds with him. And then I was asked to get involved in the North Dakota Meadowlark Initiative. And I saw Andy as a great potential collaborator because his work focused a little more on some of the songbirds than mine currently did. And I wanted to see opportunities for my students to interact with others than just me. And so bringing in other expertise was great. And so what we're doing is setting out audio recorders and exploring how reseeding grasslands to essentially enhance that grassland, expand some of it. What does that do for grassland songbirds? And so we're going to focus on a few grassland species and see how their occurrence changes across the landscape.
What are you hoping students will learn by working with you at UND's Felege Wildlife Lab? What are some of the highlights from the work you are doing through research at the Wildlife Lab with your students?
Yeah, so one of the major things for students working with me is getting them hands-on experience. I'm hoping to help prepare them for the future to work in conservation areas, or at the very least have an appreciation, because maybe their employment might not land in conservation, but that they can have an impact in some way with it. Help them foster the love that most of them have for the outdoors, whether that's hunting, fishing, bird watching, kayaking, canoeing, protecting these special places that make that happen. I want to teach them different skills. I want to have them meet different partners and learn about partnerships that will help them achieve that. And so that's a lot of what we do in my lab is we work with different partners. Like I mentioned already, the Air Force Base, the USDA, I work with the Smithsonian, the North Dakota Game and Fish. The list is pretty long, Pheasants Forever. All of those different folks are super important in coming together to do conservation. Teaching students how to work with them, how to use new technology. We do a lot with technology. We work with drones or UAS, whatever you want to call those. We work with radio telemetry. We have GPS collars or GPS backpacks actually on turkeys. We do a whole variety of things with the hope of that being something that'll benefit the future for conservation.
What inspired you to become a researcher in the field with a focus on migratory birds? And what inspires you about this work today?
Yeah, I grew up hunting, and my dad, he had 2 daughters and thought, wow, they're going to be expensive. They're going to go shopping with mom. Turns out we were even more expensive than he realized because both of us picked up hunting. And by the time he got us each a Benelli shotgun, my sister had a lab. I had a Chesapeake Bay Retriever. Parkas for duck hunting, trips to Saskatchewan. He took us twice. We were exceedingly expensive, and lots of shotgun shells. So, but it was from hunting that I really sparked my conservation passion. I probably have a different trajectory in hunting than a lot of people that go through the maturation process of it. I started going when I couldn't hunt and tagged along. So it wasn't about the harvest whatsoever. It was about watching the sunrise and being with my dad and with my sister and with the dogs. That was the thing that drove me. And so I came to hunting in a way of just appreciating its beauty of where these birds are, the natural resources, all of that. And that's what sparked in me when I was very young. And I decided at 13 I was going to be a waterfowl biologist because I just loved being outside. I loved being where you could watch the birds come in and land, and just the camaraderie that hunting also brought in these places that were kind of spiritual almost.
What is the most important lesson you have learned from your time tracking and studying migratory birds?
It's the Prairie Wildlife Management Area and Prairie Chicken Wildlife. So Prairie is on one part of it, and then this is the Prairie Chicken Wildlife Management Area. So I think a little history here. Where we're standing is actually at a bridge that they call the Release Bridge. And in the 90s, folks actually released prairie chickens here as part of a reintroduction effort. And that reintroduction effort was decades in the making by a guy named Ed Bry, who was super passionate about prairie chickens and the grasslands. And he worked with partners to try to build out grasslands in this area in Grand Forks County to be able to reintroduce and bring back the prairie chicken. But it wasn't just about the prairie chicken. This area is incredibly important from a standpoint of grassland birds as a whole. They're the most threatened group of birds, and as a result, we need habitat. And sometimes it takes iconic species, game species, to get people to get action on the ground, to be able to put habitat on the ground, to have the money to do conservation, because that comes a lot of times from hunter dollars or charismatic species or game species to do that. And this particular area was built out with the prairie chicken maybe as that iconic leader doing it, the species that we had as the poster child, but it's important for grassland birds. And we see that in all of Grand Forks County. We have a whole Prairie Partners project that's been built out with grasslands that are important for those birds.
What can you tell us about the flyways in our region here, including the Red River Valley and the Prairie Pothole regions?
Yeah, so charismatic species, you mentioned some of the ones we tend to think about classically here on the prairie. The meadowlark. The meadowlark is something a lot of people actually see, hear, familiar with, state bird, and using those as talking points about bigger issues like conservation, loss of grassland habitat, the need for enhancing grassland habitats. What does that all mean? Charismatic species are kind of the way to have that conversation. They get to people in different ways. They speak different emotions, or they elicit different emotions. And because of that, much like birds in my commencement speech, it's your way to share a message. And I think they're incredibly important in our communication efforts in the conservation arena.
What is the most enduring lesson you have learned from the prairie?
Well, the first thing is that in protecting the prairie, it's going to be all about partnerships. And partnerships are going to come sometimes even from unlikely places. Don't ever think that, like some of the work that I've gotten to do on migratory birds is coming from arenas that I didn't expect. Working with the Air Force Base, for example, and different things like that. And so partnerships, they're key to it all. And I think that's really, really important. Other things, I find surprises from birds all the time as we get new technologies and new ways to track them. When we think we know everything we could know about them, we learn something new, something different. And then I think there's a lot of life lessons by stopping and listening to the birds, stopping and taking them in, watching them, that I think is really important. And that pause in life, I'm a highly energetic individual who does a whole lot, but the moments I stop and take in the prairie, take in the birds, there's an awful lot there where you get a chance to reflect and think about where things are going, think about where you've been, and what role you're going to play in that as part of a really vibrant ecosystem that really needs us right now when it comes to grasslands in particular. I mean, it's one of the most threatened ecosystems globally. And so sitting here and thinking about that when you look out across the landscape, what can we all do and how can we do it? And you don't have to be a biologist to be that. You can do it from wearing a lot of different hats. And I think that's really key. I think everybody just needs to get out there and enjoy the prairies. And especially here in North Dakota, we got them all around us. Step outside, get out of the hustle and bustle and embrace them. And you'll learn a little bit about what's all around you, but you'll probably learn a lot about yourself in that process too. Certainly find some common ground with a lot of others.
And now we turn to Dr. Andy Boyce, who speaks to us from his office in Montana where he works with the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center.
Your bio says that you tend to study entire communities of rather than like a focus on an individual charismatic species, that you tend to study entire communities. So what does a community approach to wildlife research offer us in conservation and in education circles? And then what draws you personally to that kind of focus, the community focus, as opposed to the species focus?
Yeah, sure. So, I think taking a community or sometimes you call it, an ecosystem level approach to conservation, can be helpful and more powerful than taking an individual species approach in many ways. One thing that comes to mind immediately is that, in our world in the Northern Great Plains, if you talk about some individual species can be controversial, or individual species may spark interest in one group or but maybe not another. But, if the focus of conservation and research is an entire ecosystem, say the mixed grass prairie of the Northern Great Plains, all of a sudden you're able to bring a lot more people and potentially a lot more resources to the table and generate a lot more interest. Beyond that, from a more sort of scientific or ecological sense, we've been studying ecology for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And one thing that everybody keeps coming back to is that these are systems. Everything is interconnected. It is often folly to take a single species approach and say, I want to save the X species, whatever that may be, and take a blinded approach to doing that. A lot of times if we do that and we don't pay attention to what's going on elsewhere in the ecosystem or other animals in that ecosystem, we may have detrimental effects on other critters. So I really think it's important, at least when possible, to take a holistic approach and try to measure responses of entire communities to some sort of management activity or conservation effort. So that's where I'm coming from there.
What does a day in the life look like for you?
Much like migratory birds, what I'm doing at any given moment is entirely dependent on the calendar. So, my sort of annual cycle is essentially, my year really kind of starts in mid-April. And that's when our migratory birds are winging their way back north to the Northern Great Plains. So in April, I am in a frenzy of gathering gear, making sure all of our technicians and interns are hired on and on their way to Montana, making sure the grad students are ready to roll, making sure we've got housing squared away for field work. And then we're heading out into eastern Montana for the spring and summer to do our work. And that is just a whirlwind of field work activities of all different sorts from late April through mid-August, basically. And then, a lot of our birds start to head south in August, or they kind of go into this stage where they're just being real sneaky and trying to put on a bunch of fat for fall migration. So at that point, everybody goes their separate ways. The students go back to the universities, interns hopefully go on to their first permanent job, and I'm headed back to Missoula, to start thinking about, processing all the data that we've gathered during the season, trying to figure out what we need to do differently next year, applying for grants, writing papers, all that sort of stuff that goes along with the job. So, there's a lot of that goes on all the way fall, through winter. I'm in the thick of it right now. And, then as we start creeping towards March, all that fieldwork prep starts ramping back up again. So, literally what that looks like in a given day, a lot of days it's 8 hours in front of the computer this time of year, doing all sorts of stuff to make sure we can do the research we want to do, to make sure that we are, publishing and communicating that research to the public and to various stakeholders around the region. But yeah, I think what it's really all about are those days in late May and early June where we're roaming around the grasslands and with a chorus of birds all around us. So yeah, that's what my life looks like.
In order to be successful or effective at this work, you really almost have to be a Swiss Army knife. I mean, you have to kind of be able to be willing to learn the on the ground, hands-on material, do the grant writing, learn to be a good communicator with the public. I mean, it sounds like you're a model of that kind of thing that I'm kind of promoting and trying to sell here, that single focus. I mean, maybe that's effective in some realms, but I have found that in conservation work, maybe particularly in a rural place, I mean, I give this statistic all the time. The county that I oversee, 1,294 square miles. That's 80 square miles larger than Rhode Island. There's two of us full time doing the job. There's about 10,469 residents according to the 2021 census. So if you do the quick math on that, that's about 8 people per square mile. Way more land and way more conservation work to be done than people to do it. And so when you're
Yeah.
in that kind of situation, as we often are in the grasslands regions, um, being a Swiss Army knife and kind of having that ability, adaptability, it seems like that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think I think people can be really successful and impactful in a couple of different ways. Either being that Swiss Army knife, being that convener, being that person who hopefully has the big picture and trying to do as much as you can in different realms to make stuff happen, or bringing together the right team of people that has the expertise. I think that's another really big important qualification for a conservation biologist or a conservation practitioner. But I do also feel compelled to call out some of the specialists, right? I mean, there are folks who are just absolutely unbelievable at doing especially coding work in my world, whether that's massive scale geospatial analyses using big data that we get from satellites, or people who develop the techniques that allow us to analyze movement data of animals. A lot of times those folks are nowhere near the Great Plains, and 24/7 365 they're thinking about one narrow thing. But to be able to pull some of those folks onto a team, and we have a lot of those experts at the Smithsonian, can just add tremendously to that. So yes, be a Swiss Army knife, but yes, also know who those experts are, to reach out to and bring onto teams when they're needed. I think is also really important.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, I'm taking what I said and I'm like, now I'm totally agreeing with you. We need both. And I wanted to ask you also, in doing some research here, I found that in 2021, you contributed to a piece that offered us a rare look inside the nests of declining prairie songbirds. Um, and so I'm just curious, like, what can we learn from the way prairie songbirds make their nests? I'm interested in like the many ways that you can make home on the prairie, I guess, and songbirds, give us this kind of way of thinking about that. And then, what was the most unexpected thing you learned as part of this work on prairie songbirds and their nesting habits?
Yeah, sure. So I'm guessing the article that you read, it was basically a kind of a mid-project peek at a project that a PhD student, Andrew Dreeland, and I have going on in north central Montana. And that project is focused on understanding biological interactions between prairie dogs and grassland songbirds. And the way that we're digging into that is through nest searching and nest monitoring. So there's a couple competing ideas about if you have songbirds nesting on prairie dog towns versus off prairie dog towns, how that might affect the way that they go about their lives and the probability of those nests surviving. So as anybody who's spent time in a prairie dog town knows, they tend to be hubs for predators. Prairie dogs are, I wouldn't say popcorn, they're a little bit bigger than popcorn, but maybe a Snickers bar of the prairie. Every predator out there is tuned into where these prairie dog colonies are because they're a great snack. Ferruginous hawks, for example, they're like a specialist on large rodents like prairie dogs, and you will always find them around prairie dog towns. Badgers, swift foxes, black-footed ferrets, coyotes, all these animals spend a lot of time around there. So one of our hypotheses was that, hey, this might be a bad deal for grassland songbirds. If they're nesting on or around prairie dog towns, it might be that they're at heightened risk of having their nest predated or eaten by a predator because there's so many around. On the other hand, we thought, prairie dogs, they graze constantly, which produces really nutrient-rich grass on prairie dog towns, if we have enough precipitation that year to grow grass anyway. They poop everywhere, thousands of kilograms of tiny little prairie dog scats all over the place. Both of those things produce a very rich, diverse, and abundant community of bugs. And every songbird, basically every songbird that's spending its time on the northern Great Plains in the summer wants to eat bugs. That's what's fueling them. That's what's fueling the growth of their chicks. And being able to access a good food source like that is really, really important. So we thought, hey, maybe these birds are nesting on colonies. Maybe they're getting a benefit because of the smorgasbord of bugs available to them to feed themselves and feed their chicks. So we have these competing ideas about what might be going on. And I don't want to scoop a graduate student here. He's still working on that project. He's got another field season to go next year. But I think our initial data are showing that, at least in terms of nest predation, so the likelihood that birds will have their nests eaten by predators, we're not seeing a tremendous difference, or we're not seeing any significant difference between birds that nest on versus off prairie dog towns, which is great, because prairie dogs, as controversial as they are, they support a lot of species. They're keystone species. So the fact that they're not having a negative effect on grassland bird nesting success is a good thing.
I'm wondering what you've learned from birds, not really just about birds, lessons that you're learning as you're out there doing this research, learning from birds.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really interesting question, and of the questions that you've had, that one kind of has made me think the most. So I would say a couple things. The first has to do with scale. So I spent a lot of time working on projects surrounding this bird called a Sprague's pipit. Specifics of the bird aren't important. It's a brown bird. It's rapidly declining. They're very cool, but that's a different story for a different day. But Sprague's pipits, from the research we've done, we know that they're basically evaluating the landscape at a scale of hundreds of thousands of acres. We draw a circle and we say, okay, inside this 100,000 acre circle, there's 90% grassland and 10% farmland. That's great. There are very few places on this in the northern Great Plains that still have that percentage of grassland. Once it drops below 90 or 80% grassland at that 100,000 acre scale, the density of Sprague's pipits start to drop off. And I'm not talking about total number. I'm talking about density in the areas of remaining grassland. So these birds, they really demand massive, massive areas of native grassland. And, that has really, made me think carefully about, trying to take a large scale approach to conservation, really underscoring how important that is. You can only do so much if you've got, 1,000 acre patch, and you can dump a ton of resources into restoring that 1,000 acre patch and making the grass as perfect as possible and maintaining fire and this and that, and that's amazing. That's phenomenal. There are a lot of species that will benefit from that. But if we want to create a healthy grassland ecosystem, we really need to be thinking at all times at large scale. So that's really something that Sprague's pipits and other species have taught me. So this kind of goes a little bit along with that, is when we're forced to think at that large scale, you realize that birds and probably grassland species in general, they don't care about how you got to an endpoint in terms of conservation. They need grass. They need grass of a certain height. Maybe they won't tolerate encroaching conifers, or they don't tolerate this much this much farm ground. That's what they care about. They don't care about the conservation model. So whether you got there by helping a rancher keep grass and grass, whether you got there by being a private NGO that bought a ranch and put a bunch of bison and prairie dogs back on there, whether it's old farm ground that's been restored like the Meadowlark Initiative in North Dakota, that's, partners have gotten together and dumped a bunch of money and resources and know-how in and restored that from crop back into grass. They don't care about the model that got you there. And, as somebody who I think is still relatively new to this world, I see a lot of, there's a lot of arguments and a lot of conflict between conservation groups with different models and different ways of getting to an end. But the birds don't care how you got there. And, I think that's a really important lesson that we can take.
If somebody comes to you and says they want to get involved in the kind of work that you're involved in, or just involved generally in working with migratory birds or grassland habitat restoration or conservation, what kind of advice would you say is like, here's a good first step, or here's where I'd send you?
Oh man. Yeah. They're bottom line is, this is a hard thing that we're trying to do, restore grasslands and conserve grasslands. So we need every possible chunk of help that we can get. And I would say my main message would be every skill set is necessary. What is it that you do well? What is it that you're passionate about? Is it podcasting? Is it research? Is it, our citizen science, as maybe somebody who has more time on their hand and wants to just go document what's out there? Do you have a giant pile of money that you're not sure what to do with? Well, donate, get on a board, buy land and start restoring it yourself. So I would say my major piece of advice would be, don't try to change who you are or spend a bunch of time, learning something new or difficult. It's use the skill sets that you have. And there are partners willing to put you to work.
And now we turn to Ashlyn Herron, a graduate student at the University of North Dakota who works with Dr. Boyce and Dr. Felege on migratory bird research, grassland birds, and building relationships with local ranchers.
Can you tell us just a little bit about what program you're in and why you're here with us today at Sertoma Park? How did you end up in Grand Forks?
For sure, yeah. So I'm a first-year master's student in Dr. Susan Felege's lab at UND. My Master of Biology. And it kind of came about in a really strange way, actually. I was on Twitter looking for some posts for a conference, and I ended up stumbling across Andy's Twitter page, and I found this post for this assistantship. And I didn't really think I had much of a chance, and I just kind of took a Hail Mary and I threw in my application. And next thing you know, I'm on a Zoom call with Susan and Andy, and very shortly after, I got the position, and then I started getting my plans in place to move to Grand Forks, move to the States. I am Canadian, so it took a little bit to get some of the paperwork in place to get down here. But
so you're from Alberta,
yes.
Is what you said.
Yes.
And then so you're working with Dr. Andy Boyce of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And you're working with Dr. Susan Felege of the Felege Wildlife Lab at the University of North Dakota.
Correct.
Both of whom I've actually recently had a chance to talk to as well. And they both speak very highly of your work and what you're up to here.
Yeah.
But I do have some Canadian-centric questions we'll get into later here, maybe.
Absolutely.
I have a deep appreciation for the Canadian sense of humor, so we might have to talk about Canadian sense of humor in relation to birds. We'll see if we can make that happen. But first, I guess I'm interested in what's the focus of your research and what motivated you to concentrate on this issue in particular?
For sure. So we are focusing on determining if the Meadowlark Initiative, which is a conservation plan through the North Dakota Game and Fish Department, focused on partnering with landowners to restore and conserve grasslands. So we're looking to see if that's effective at creating habitat for grassland birds. So we're using them as our bioindicator if we're restoring ecosystem health across, honestly, all over Western North Dakota. My study sites this summer were all the way from almost a couple hours from South Dakota to where I could see Saskatchewan. So we were very far ranging. And I've always been passionate about, well, I shouldn't say always. This is a kind of a funny origin story. I grew up on the prairies from a ranching background, and I really took growing up on the prairies for granted. And then it kind of took a combination of me going back to school and my dad retiring and selling the farm for me to realize how important it is to be on the prairies. So I had an internship with the Nature Conservancy of Canada based out of the southwest corner of Alberta. So the heart of the prairies, like gorgeous untouched grassland. And took me about a week, and I realized like this is the coolest ecosystem someone could work in. So that kind of sent me on my trajectory. All my seasonal work that I've had since my undergrad's been grassland bird related. And then I've also worked on, it's called the Multi-SAR project. So it's multiple species at risk. So it's very similar to the Meadowlark Initiative, but it's the Alberta version, and it's with Alberta Conservation Association. And our whole goal there was to work with landowners and help them conserve their properties to benefit species at risk, as well as being a working landscape. So that's kind of where my passion lies, is like we're protecting wildlife and species at risk and birds, and also helping ranchers stay ranching. So, because that's a daughter of a landowner, like it's very much in my blood. So even though I took it for granted, it's definitely sent me on my path of where I am. And I think loving the prairies has become my personality trait. I'm sure I've been annoying to a lot of people, but yeah, it's changed my life. Obviously, I'm here now, so.
And I didn't preview this question for you, but I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between attention and affection when we're thinking about grasslands and prairie habitat. For you, which of those things comes first? Did you cultivate affection for the prairie the more you paid attention to it, or was it I already have affection for it and that causes me or inspires me to pay more attention?
So honestly, when I just growing up on the prairies, I kind of thought I knew everything about it, and I've been there, done that. I wanted to go work in grizzly bear habitat and chase bears through the snow, which is hilarious now because I wouldn't be caught dead working in grizzly bear country. But so no, it was definitely, the more I learned about it, the more I was like, this is the coolest place. And it was also like, I feel like I have to make up for lost time, because I look back and I wish I had the access to the prairies, that like living on them as I did when I was 15 years old. As I do, I don't have that now. So yeah, it's just like, it was a wasted time for I could have done that way better. And now it's definitely, the more I learn, but it's interesting too, because you talk to a lot of landowners, and they know the value of their land, and they adore their land, and they know so much about the species on their land that they don't need the scientists to tell them how cool their burrowing owls are. They know, right? And they're tracking it. And you talk to people and be like, oh, the meadowlarks, they haven't been coming back as often this year. And it's so fascinating because they haven't gone to school to track that kind of stuff, but it's that generational knowledge that gets passed down. And ranching was never in my future. It was never going to be the path I took. So my dad shared lots of knowledge with me, but he didn't instill in me that love of the prairies, because I think he wanted me to go on to better things. And that was kind of his way of, he wanted me to go and do something else, and then come back if I wanted to. So I think that was kind of how I kind of came about loving the prairies the way I do. Yeah. It's deeply rooted, and then it's come full circle, I guess.
What does a day in the life of your work look
For sure.
like? What does it look like?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with the field work answer, because right now my life is a lot of computer screens and coffee. But so we use they're called audio moths. So they're a recording unit that we pre-program before we send out onto the field. So we would put in our little recording schedule, and then these units are about the size of the palm of my hand, and they're definitely not waterproof, so they go in a little Ziploc bag. And then we hike out to restored sites, and then we have native sites, and then we have cropland, just our 3 treatments, and we deploy our units. So we have a little manual post pounder and then T-posts, and we're out there getting them in the ground, and then record the locations. And then also we're out on the prairies, so we get to just kind of do some really cool birding and take lots of pictures of plants, and just really enjoy that time on private land that not everyone gets to see. And then so the nice thing about these recording units is they're kind of like a set it and forget it kind of thing. So we would go back about every 10 days just to make sure that they were still doing their thing, which was good. We did that because it's our first field season, so there's some bugs we had to work out. Cows like to chew on the bag, and then all of a sudden you're getting bags full of water, and someone ran over one. Like it's a whole thing. So we have to go and check them. And then those ran from beginning of June to beginning of July. And then we went back out and collected the units, and then we were doing vegetation surveys. So some belt transects, and then like we know that birds select habitat based on like structure. So we were also using a Robel pole to do, it's called VOR. I can't think of what it actually stands for right now, but height and density of the grass or the plants, and then litter depth. And yeah, so we're just trying to get a snapshot of what the habitat's looking like. And then we're in the phase now of trying to sort through all that data. Like I have like over a terabyte of sound files. It's like I had 11 properties that we deployed units on, and each one got at minimum 9. So yeah, there's a lot of files that we got. So it's awesome to have that much information. So we're using some AI tools to sort through the sound files, and because I don't have enough time myself to go through every single one.
That's one of the ways where new technology can really play a role in being able to sort through that kind of data and those kind of data. And really, I think also, it sounds like there's still just so much that we don't know.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
So much we don't know about this landscape.
Yeah.
What kind of challenges do grassland birds face currently,
for sure,
as a group, as a species?
Right. So the biggest threat, and this is what we're seeing for any loss of biodiversity, is habitat loss. Especially with these birds being a migratory species, like their landscape is changing so fast, and it's faster than they can deal with realistically. And like they could have a piece of or patch of native grass go south, come back, and it's gone. There's something else there now. And fragmentation also plays like that is part of fragmentation. Like a lot of these species evolved for these huge expanses of grassland, and those pieces are becoming smaller and smaller and broken up and less suitable. So, we can do everything. We can focus on individual species, but if we don't fix the habitat piece, if they don't have a place to go, everything we do it's not going to do anything. It's not going to have any long lasting effects. So definitely the loss of habitat. So that's kind of why it's so important, I think, to work on this restoration piece, is because we've influenced our landscape so much now that so much has been lost. It's almost like I feel like it's our duty now to put some pieces back and learn as much as we can about how to do that effectively, because we're losing it to the point now where it's so dire. So unfortunately, I shouldn't laugh. That's not a good thing. But it's not good.
Well, and Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who I reference a lot, she's been hugely influential in my work. Her writing, Grading Sweetgrass, is a very kind of well-known book. Her prior work, Gathering Moss, she braids together Indigenous knowledge, Western science, and her own kind of personal and family experience on the land. And one of the things that she notes is that the first step in ecological restoration is often a restoring of our relationship to land. That's part of what this kind of effort is about, is learning the story. Here's a big question: how do we change the story? How do we do that?
Right. I think every moment of outreach we can do, I think, is really important, because people aren't going to work to protect things they don't understand. And this kind of made me think of something, like in chatting with all my landowners. I think I had 9 with this project this summer. It's interesting that their take on what they're doing. I very, very seldomly did anyone tell me, I'm growing this grass to feed my cows. It was, I'm growing this grass because I want to make habitat for wildlife, for game animals, non-game animals. So it's interesting, because it's like they know what they're doing, and we need to communicate that with other people, that like we can all play a role in this. And it's a big thing, the restore. I just think, like in Alberta, like we have so many habitat types, and like I've mentioned this before, but like the grasslands are kind of in the background, because everyone loves the big mountains and the big lakes. And it's like we have the coolest grassland, we have the coolest ecosystem, and we all have a piece of it. And we just need to talk more about it. And that's something I've noticed in North Dakota too, is there's a lot more grassland outreach than I've noticed and like, it's the same group in Alberta, like we're doing a really good job too, but it's the same group of people. And they're doing awesome things and lots of awesome collaboration, but it's just, there's such a diverse group of organizations here that are working on it, which is so cool to see. It's coming from all angles. So I think the pieces are in motion. I think we just need to get more people to care about it and by doing more outreach.
Well, and, you caught yourself laughing at a thing that you said, maybe I shouldn't be laughing, that's not funny. But that actually inspires another question for me is, conservation work is like very serious.
Yeah.
We have really serious challenges that we're facing, and yet it's always been true in like the kind of family storytelling I grew up on, uncles and aunts and grandparents. The people who taught me to love the land also have deep, rich senses of humor.
Mm-hmm.
They also have a kind of vibrant, lived relationship with place. And this brings me to a question, I guess. I appreciate the Canadian sense of humor. What is a grassland bird that has a kind of Canadian sense of humor? Or what can you learn sense of humor from birds? What kind of humorous things have you noticed or learned from birds?
Yeah. Oh man. I'm thinking of like my ornithology instructor when I was in undergrad. He always would say like, they're out there singing these birds are out here singing when really they're using, I'm going to have to make this PG-13, but like they're using their not nice words to kind of defend their, so like, it comes off really sweet and beautiful, but they're actually like very not nice. So I think it's that sense of humor of having like kind of that understated, you have to think about it for a little bit for it to be like, oh, what was that? Yeah. And also like, it's so funny too to watch the like birds in the field when you're out there and you have bobolinks that are just scrapping or long spurs that are just, and it's beautiful to watch, but they're just going at it. And I think that's so funny because it's the double entendre of what's going on. And I guess kind of for conservation in general, like with my kind of, it's one of those things where I think we all need to have a good sense of humor for doing this work, because sometimes there's days where if you don't laugh, you'll cry. So, and also like, there's a lot of big things and a lot of scary concepts, and like, it's important not to just like focus on the doom, I think. And that's circling back to like the restoring, like, you got to focus on your wins when you get them, because you're not going to get people on board with doom and doom and doom. So that's why it's fun to focus on birds.
With the last name of Herron, you probably had to study birds.
Yeah.
But for anyone anyone else, whether or not their last name is also a species name for a bird, what advice do you have for them to get involved with this kind of work, or
Sure.
Any kind of conservation work on grasslands?
I would say, like, keep your eyes open for any opportunity. My first conservation job, like I said, I wasn't even really excited to work on the prairies at that point, but I just took it because it was a cool job and it just changed my life. So, and then also coming here, like, just if you think if you're excited about something, take that opportunity. And also, like, there's lots of cool ways to get involved in conservation, like through volunteering. Like, there's so many organizations that are contributing, and they have lots of cool, like, volunteering to like test the waters, get some experience, and reach out to people that are doing this kind of work and build your network. Like, it's so exciting to meet people that are passionate about grasslands, and I feel like we all kind of have this common trend where we just love talking about it. So, and birds too, like, we all just love talking about birds and grasslands. So reach out and we'll see. Like, I would love to help people get their feet on the ground doing this kind of work. So yeah, I've had so many people in my life that have influenced me and been awesome mentors and connected me to opportunities working in conservation and working with birds. So yeah, I think we're all in a position where we'd like to help people get involved.
Thank you for listening to Common Ground, a Prairie podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. We'd like to extend a big thanks to all of our listeners and all of our guests today. This podcast has been a labor of love, and we could not have done it without the generous support of our guests, the funding provided by the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust, and listeners like you. Special thanks to Crista Fiala for producing today's episode, and to Matthew Connolly for providing the theme music. We look forward to sharing more episodes with you this year, including conversations with farmers, ranchers, conservationists, and other special guests. Until next time, this is Josh Anderson signing off for Common Ground, a Prairie podcast. Common Ground, a Prairie podcast, is supported by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. If you would like to contribute to our on-the-ground conservation initiatives and our conservation internship and mentorship programs here in North Dakota, please consider making a donation to us through our member support link on our Spotify page. Your contributions will directly support the Walsh County Three Rivers Soil Conservation District, where this year we will plant over 10,000 trees and several hundred acres of conservation grass, pollinators, and cover crops, while also offering hands-on conservation job training to our high school and college interns. You can also support our efforts by liking, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Thank you.